"If you think this test is measuring intelligence, you've already failed," the old janitor muttered as the last atmospheric shuttle unloaded another wave of eager candidates. He didn't even look up from his mop, sweeping away metallic dust left behind by foreign boots. But nobody bothered to listen. No one ever did. Every 10 years, the Galactic Cognitive Assessment opened its grand obsidian doors. For one grueling week, the brightest minds from over 300 star systems gathered beneath the towering glass dome of the Orion Evaluation Complex. Winning didn't just earn you personal prestige, it granted your entire homeworld priority access to high research councils, strategic planning divisions, and military command academies across known space. Planetary governments spent trillions preparing a single citizen to qualify. Dynasties built their futures around this exam. Entire careers rose and fell based on a single afternoon. As the massive entrance gates slid open with a heavy hydraulic hiss, thousands of contestants streamed inside. They wore ceremonial uniforms encrusted with family crests, polished medals from provincial universities, and academic robes dyed in colors representing worlds Nathan Walker had only ever seen in Hollywood documentaries. Nathan adjusted the strap of his worn canvas backpack and quietly joined the end of the queue. His faded gray sweatshirt, washed-out blue jeans, and scuffed sneakers looked completely out of place among the pristine crowds. A tall alien candidate with skin like polished chrome glanced down at him, a condescending smirk playing across his narrow lips. "Wrong building, human," the alien sneered, his vocal synthesizer filtering his voice into a melodic chime. "Visitor registration and tourist seating are across the street." A few nearby candidates chuckled, though none slowed their pace. Nathan looked over his shoulder casually, as if checking whether someone else had been addressed. "Thanks," he said with an easy smile, resting his hands in his pockets. "I almost believed you." The chrome-skinned alien blinked, taken aback that the solitary human hadn't cowered or stammered an apology. Before he could formulate a response, Nathan continued walking, his blue eyes taking in the vast foyer with genuine, unhurried curiosity. Floating holographic displays hovered 50 feet overhead, flickering through names, sector rankings, and testing protocols in hundreds of languages simultaneously. Automated security drones drifted overhead, silently scanning identification chips embedded in candidate wristbands. Everything felt efficient, astronomically expensive, and strangely theatrical. Nathan had imagined something intimidating, a cold, sterile fortress of pure logic. Instead, it reminded him of a major international airport mixed with a university campus during finals week. The air smelled of ozone, nervous sweat, and synthetic floral perfume. He noticed panicked faces everywhere. Some candidates were muttering complex quantum formulas under their breath like desperate prayers. Others stared at glowing digital slates until security officers barked at them to power every device down. One insectoid contestant from the Vegas sector was hyperventilating so violently that his teammates had to administer a calming pheromone spray before he collapsed. Nathan checked the time on his simple analog wrist watch, the hand-wound timepiece his father had handed him before he left the farm in Ohio. "Hope they have decent coffee inside," he murmured to himself. A woman standing directly behind him turned with an amused smile. She wore the sharp navy uniform of Earth's Scientific Exchange Division. "First time?" she asked, her voice tight with suppressed tension. "Is it that obvious?" Nathan asked, looking back. "Only because everyone else looks like they're about to face a firing squad," she replied with a dry chuckle. "My name's Commander Miller. Nathan Walker. And tell me, Commander, should I be terrified too?" Before Miller could answer, a deep, resonant chime echoed through the vast hall, rattling the glass dome above. "All registered candidates, proceed immediately to Examination Hall 1. Once inside, all communications with the outside world will be severed until testing concludes." The mood in the hall instantly shifted. Whispering stopped. Smiles vanished. Even the haughtiest candidates stiffened their spines. Nathan followed the massive wave of people through towering metallic doors that slowly sealed behind them with a low, definitive thud. Inside, the chamber was breathtaking. Thousands of identical desks stretched across a circular floor under a vaulted ceiling projecting a real-time map of the night sky. At the dead center stood a raised platform where 7 chief examiners stood like silent marble statues, observing the arrival of the galaxy's elite. Nathan found his assigned seat in the middle section and set his canvas backpack beside his chair. Around him, contestants stretched their fingers, closed their eyes, or stared blankly ahead. Nathan simply looked around, taking it all in, not with awe, but with the quiet contemplation of someone visiting an ancient historical museum. High above them, a massive red countdown display flickered to life. 059, 058. Nathan glanced once at the sealed, tamper-proof exam booklet resting on his desk. Then leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, looking less like a candidate on the verge of a life-defining trial, and more like a man waiting patiently for a delayed flight. The red light of the giant countdown display cast a faint crimson glow across the thousands of faces packed inside the chamber. 045, 044. Around Nathan, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Chairs creaked as contestants shifted in their seats. A few rows ahead, an avian candidate was drumming 4 feathered fingers frantically against the armrest, muttering statistical probability trees. To Nathan's right, a hulking, 4-armed warrior scholar from the Centauri border was staring at his sealed examination booklet as if trying to burn through the security foil with pure willpower. Nathan looked back up at the vaulted ceiling. The projected constellation slowly rotated, pinpointing the precise galactic coordinates of every homeworld represented in the hull. "Nice touch," Nathan muttered under his breath. The chrome-skinned alien from the registration line happened to be seated 2 rows ahead. Hearing Nathan, he glanced back over his shoulder, his silver brow furrowing in disdain. "You're sightseeing, human. At a moment like this?" Nathan offered a mild shrug. "First time in this sector. Might as well enjoy the view." The alien let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "You humans truly have no concept of where you are or what is at stake today." "Maybe not yet," Nathan replied quietly, his tone remaining as smooth and unbothered as a calm lake. Before the alien could utter another snide remark, every light in the chamber cut out simultaneously. A collective gasp rippled through the thousands of candidates. A second later, a single, blinding white spotlight snapped on, illuminating the central elevated platform. The 7 chief examiners stood in a tight circle, their faces shadowed. They represented species whose scientific breakthroughs had built the interstellar economy. Their names were written in textbooks across 100 star systems. The tall, slender female at the center, a species known for living centuries, stepped forward. When she spoke, her voice was amplified by localized acoustic fields, carrying clearly into the ears of every person present without a single echo. "Welcome," she began, her tone devoid of emotion. "Today, every one of you believes you have come here to prove your intelligence. Most of you are mistaken." A heavy silence settled over the vast hall. "Knowledge can be memorized," she continued, her piercing eyes sweeping across the sea of desks. "Patterns can be rehearsed. Logic can be programmed into the simplest AI. Intelligence, true cognitive superiority, is something far more difficult to observe. What we evaluate today cannot be purchased, inherited, copied, or borrowed." Nathan listened attentively, not because the grandiose speech moved him, but because it reminded him of something his grandfather used to say while elbow-deep in Greece, fixing broken tractor engines in their barn back in Ohio. "Nathan, if a salesman spends 5 minutes telling you exactly what he's measuring, spend 10 minutes figuring out what he's trying to hide." Once the timer begins, the chief examiner announced, "You will have exactly 4 hours. Leaving early is permitted. Returning after submission is strictly forbidden. Communication of any kind will result in immediate disqualification and a lifetime ban for your planetary delegation." A fresh wave of anxiety surged through the room. Candidates began frantically straightening their blank scratch paper, cracking their knuckles, or adjusting their breathing. Across the aisle, a young reptilian contestant whispered to his teammate, "I've spent 6 years preparing for these 4 hours." His teammate didn't look at him. "Then today changes everything." Nathan shook his head slightly. "That's a terrifying amount of weight to put on a 4-hour test," he thought. Reaching down into his canvas bag, Nathan pulled out a single, plain mechanical pencil. No glowing digital stylus. No quantum-linked neural interface. Just a basic plastic pencil with a slightly worn eraser. He'd used it for 3 years of college because it felt balanced in his grip. Commander Miller, seated a few desks away, caught sight of it and let out a soft, nervous whisper. "You brought a pencil?" Nathan held it up slightly. "It writes." She offered a faint smile, but quickly caught herself as a floating security drone drifted nearby, its red optical sensor flashing a subtle warning. 010, 009. 008. Nathan placed the pencil neatly alongside his sealed booklet, folded his hands over his stomach, and took a slow, deep breath. He wasn't trying to force himself to stay calm. He was simply present. The chrome-skinned candidate glanced back one last time, eyeing Nathan's relaxed posture with genuine confusion. "Are you truly not terrified, human?" Nathan considered the question for a brief second before answering truthfully. "I usually get nervous when I think I know everything. Today, I'm just curious." The alien frowned, unable to process the logic. 003, 002. 001, a deep, reverberating chime echoed through the floorboards. "The assessment has officially begun." The sound of 4,000 tamper-proof foil seals tearing open at once sounded like a sudden downpour of rain against a tin roof. Instantly, the hall erupted into frantic activity. The soft rustle of paper, the furious clicking of mechanical styluses, and the low hum of nervous breathing filled the space. AI was strictly banned, neural implants were dampened by spatial fields, and scratch slates were monitored by anti-cheat telemetry. Every calculation, every deduction, had to come purely from the brain of the individual sitting at the desk. Nathan didn't open his booklet right away. He paused for half a heartbeat. Growing up around mechanical work had taught him one vital lesson: the immediate instinct was almost always the wrong one. When a machine jammed, the person who grabbed the biggest wrench first was usually the person who broke the housing. Finally, Nathan reached down and peeled back the dark blue cover of his assessment folder. He didn't find a thick packet of pages filled with multidimensional calculus, spatial geometry, or economic modeling. There was only a single, crisp white sheet of paper. At the very top, printed in bold, simple black lettering, was a single instruction: read everything carefully before attempting to answer. Beneath that instruction lay a single paragraph, a dense, elegantly constructed logic problem detailing a hypothetical diplomatic crisis between 3 interstellar factions. Complete with resource constraints, time limits, and conflicting ethical protocols. At the bottom of the page sat a wide, empty rectangular box. Nothing else. No sub-questions. No multiple-choice options. Just the prompt and the box. Nathan read the paragraph once, his eyes moving slowly across the page. Then, without moving a muscle, he read it a second time. Around him, the room was already spiraling into hyper-focused chaos. The insectoid candidate across the aisle was frantically filling page after page of scratch paper with complex algebraic matrices. The chrome-skinned alien 2 rows ahead was grinning with absolute confidence, his stylus flying across his digital draft pad like a weaver's shuttle, building an elaborate multi-tiered decision tree. Nathan remained completely still. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his legs, and looked back up at the star-mapped ceiling. A few rows back, Commander Miller happened to look up from her own frantic reading. Seeing Nathan leaning back with his hands behind his head, her brow furrowed in horror. "Come on, Nathan," she mouthed silently, her eyes wide with panic. "Don't freeze up now. But Nathan wasn't frozen. His mind was miles away, drifting back to a dusty garage in late July, watching his grandfather examine an old radio that 5 different mechanics had declared unfixable. Nathan, the old man's voice echoed in his memory, when everyone is sprinting toward the exact same answer. Stop and ask yourself who built the finish line. Nathan lowered his gaze back to the white page. The scenario presented in the problem was brilliant, devilishly so. The prose was elegant, the variables lined up with mathematical perfection, and every sentence subtly guided the reader toward a single, inevitable logical conclusion. Every assumption embedded in the premise seemed totally harmless on its own. But when stacked together, they formed a flawless, invisible cage. A small, quiet smile touched the corner of Nathan's lips. "Well, aren't you clever?" he whispered to the empty air. He didn't touch his pencil. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Then 3. A few neighboring candidates, taking a brief breath from their frantic writing, glanced over at the human. They blinked in surprise. The human's paper was completely blank. He hadn't drawn a single diagram. He hadn't written a single variable. The chrome-skinned alien glanced back, seeing Nathan sitting idle. A smug, dismissive grin spread across his metallic features. "Giving up already," he whispered softly, careful not to attract the drones. "I told you that you didn't belong here." Nathan met his gaze calmly. "Not giving up," he replied softly. "Then why aren't you writing?" "I'm still reading." The alien let out a quiet huff of laughter and returned to his furious calculations, convinced the human had simply hit a mental wall. A roving assistant examiner, a tall woman wearing the formal gray robes of the evaluation board, noticed the exchange. She paused beside Nathan's desk, her sharp eyes dropping to the pristine, untouched white page resting in front of him. She waited a moment, expecting him to dive in. When he didn't, she bent down slightly, keeping her voice at an absolute whisper. "Is there an issue with your testing materials, candidate?" "No, ma'am," Nathan replied politely. "Do you require clarification on the text?" "No, ma'am." The examiner frowned, her trained neutrality slipping for a fraction of a second. "Then why haven't you begun writing your response?" Nathan looked up, his blue eyes clear and completely unburdened by stress. "I'm just trying to figure out whether this is actually a test, or if it's an insult." The examiner froze. Her protocol demanded she remain silent, but for 3 full seconds, she simply stared at the human. Finding no words, she straightened her back and slowly walked down the aisle, though her eyes lingered on him as she departed. Nathan watched her go. Then he turned back to the page. He picked up his cheap mechanical pencil. He didn't fill the answer box with equations. He didn't draft a strategic manifesto. Instead, right across the center of the blank rectangular box, he wrote one single, clear sentence in neat handwriting. He read it once. He nodded to himself. Then, Nathan Walker closed his examination booklet, set his pencil down beside it, and checked his watch. Less than 4 minutes had elapsed since the start of the test. The silence inside the grand hall was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, frantic scratching of thousands of styluses and pencils against paper. Over 3,000 of the galaxy's most brilliant intellects were deep in the trench of complex problem-solving, wrestling with trade-offs, ethical paradoxes, and resource allocations. Nathan waited quietly for 30 seconds, not because he doubted his submission, but because he knew standing up too abruptly would create a scene. High above, the giant digital clock read, 3 hours, 56 minutes, 12 seconds. Nathan picked up his closed assessment folder, slid his mechanical pencil into his sweatshirt pocket, and stood up from his chair. The floorboard gave a tiny squeak. The chrome-skinned alien sitting 2 rows ahead glanced up, annoyed by the distraction. When he saw Nathan holding his closed booklet and stepping into the aisle, his eyes widened in utter disbelief. "Where do you think you're going?" the alien hissed under his breath. Nathan stopped for a fraction of a second, looking down at him. "I'm finished." The alien stared at him as if Nathan had just spoken in ancient gibberish. Finished? It's been 4 minutes. I know, Nathan said with a slight nod. Have a good exam. Without another word, Nathan turned and began walking down the long central carpet toward the elevated platform at the front of the hall. His footsteps were soft, but in a room filled with intense, desperate concentration, the sound of someone walking away from their desk was like a thunderclap. Head after head began to turn. A candidate from a high-gravity world dropped his stylus. A scholar from the inner core stopped mid-equation, staring at the back of the faded gray sweatshirt. Who is that? Is he forfeiting? Did the human panic? He couldn't have answered it. Nobody answers it in 4 minutes. Commander Miller watched him walk past her row. Her mouth opened slightly in pure shock. Nathan, what are you doing? She whispered to herself, feeling a sudden wave of defeat on behalf of Earth's delegation. Up on the central platform, the assistant examiner who had spoken to Nathan earlier saw him approaching. She stepped to the edge of the dais, raising a hand in warning. Candidate, she said, her voice carrying across the front rows. The examination has only just begun. If you leave your station now, your booklet will be collected and your testing period will be permanently terminated. Nathan smiled warmly as he reached the foot of the platform. I understand, ma'am. You have nearly 4 hours remaining, she pressed, genuinely trying to give him a chance to turn back. There is no penalty for taking your time. Nathan gently set his closed folder on the polished obsidian counter between them. I don't need the 4 hours. The examiner hesitated. In her 40 years of administering the Galactic Cognitive Assessment, she had seen thousands of candidates collapse under pressure, cry, hyperventilate, or quietly hand in blank papers out of sheer despair. But those people always walked away with bowed heads, flushed cheeks, and trembling hands. The human standing before her looked entirely relaxed. His posture was open, his eyes were bright, and he looked like a man who had just finished reading the morning newspaper over breakfast. Are you entirely certain of this submission, Mr. Walker? She asked quietly. Yes, ma'am. I'm sure. She stared at him for 2 more seconds, then slowly reached out and pulled the folder toward her scanner terminal. She tapped her administrative key. Beep. A soft, synthesized voice chimed from the console, submission received. Candidate 884 Walker, Nathan. Status, concluded. You are now officially withdrawn from the testing pool, she stated, looking up from the screen. You may exit through the main archway. Thank you, Nathan said. Before he could turn around, a stern, deep voice cut through the ambient hum of the hall. It was the senior chief examiner, the venerable scholar who had delivered the opening speech. He had stepped to the edge of the platform, his dark, ancient eyes locked onto Nathan. Candidate Walker, the old scholar called out. Nathan paused, turning back. Yes, sir. The senior examiner studied the young human carefully. Most candidates who surrender so quickly are unable to meet my eyes. Yet you stand there without a trace of shame or disappointment. Nathan blinked, thinking it over for a brief second. Should I be disappointed, sir? The senior examiner's lips twitched slightly, a fleeting, almost imperceptible hint of an emotion that might have been surprise, or perhaps amusement. But his face quickly hardened back into stoic discipline. Safe travels, Mr. Walker, the old man said softly. Nathan offered a polite nod. Thank you, sir. To you as well. With that, Nathan turned his back on the platform, walked down the grand central aisle, and pushed open the heavy metallic exit doors. Bright, warm morning sunlight spilled into the dim hall for a split second before the heavy doors sealed shut behind him. Outside, the air was crisp and smelled of pine from the surrounding academy gardens. Nathan stretched his arms over his head, taking a deep, satisfying breath of fresh air. Man, he muttered to himself, looking around at the quiet garden paths. Now, where do I find that coffee? Inside examination hall 1, the silence returned, but it was fragile now. The sight of a candidate walking out after 4 minutes had planted a seed of distraction in the minds of hundreds. But as the clock ticked onward, the pressure of the test slowly forced the candidates back into their work. Meanwhile, up on the central platform, routine procedures were underway. Every submitted booklet was automatically placed onto an optical scanner, digitized, and routed through the assessment network's massive quantum evaluation engine. The grading system was an ancient, flawless piece of software designed to analyze logical structures, linguistic nuance, and strategic viability within milliseconds. It had graded millions of exams over 2 centuries without a single glitch. The assistant examiner who had taken Nathan's paper picked up his booklet and placed it onto the primary scanner pad. A blue line of light swept across the white sheet. She waited for the standard green confirmation light, the signal that the response had been logged and assigned a preliminary percentile score. Instead, the screen flickered. A bright yellow warning box flashed across the interface, processing delay, unable to complete automated score. The examiner frowned. She tapped the console screen. System lag, she muttered under her breath. A secondary examiner stepped over, adjusting his spectacles. That's impossible. The local node has 40 quantum cores assigned to it. Force a rescan. She wiped the glass, repositioned Nathan's single sheet, and triggered the optical beam a second time. The blue light swept down the page. Stopped halfway. BZZZT. Error 404, evaluation framework unavailable, the secondary examiner scoffed. Scanner mechanical fault. Use Terminal 3. They carried the single piece of paper over to Terminal 3, a state-of-the-art diagnostic unit that had been recalibrated only 48 hours prior. She placed the paper down. The scanner hummed. The result appeared on the screen within 1 second. Evaluation framework unavailable, conceptual mapping, failed, logical tree index, null, by now. 3 chief examiners had stopped monitoring the floor. They stood in a tight huddle around Terminal 3, staring at the flashing red error messages. Is the handwriting unreadable? One asked, leaning in. Did he write in an unregistered dialect? No, the assistant examiner said, her voice dropping to an anxious whisper. It's written in standard intergalactic English. Perfect script. The senior chief examiner walked over slowly, his hands folded behind his back. The low murmur of red alert codes on the platform had finally caught his full attention. What is the nature of the disruption? He asked calmly. Sir, the assistant said nervously, the automated network refuses to score candidate Walker's submission. It's flagging the entry as unclassifiable. Unclassifiable? The senior examiner raised an eyebrow. An empty box is classified as a 0. A random scribble is classified as invalid. What did he write? Protocol prohibits viewing raw candidate answers until the testing window closes. Override the protocol, the senior examiner commanded coldly. If the system cannot process the submission, standard procedure is already broken. Display the raw input. The assistant typed in her master clearance code. The terminal screen refreshed, displaying a high-resolution scan of Nathan Walker's single-page booklet. There was the opening instruction, read everything carefully before attempting to answer. There was the complex, beautifully written scenario about diplomatic trade-offs. And there, inside the rectangular answer box, was a single handwritten line of text. The examiners leaned closer. The sentence read, this problem assumes that peace requires compromise, but your premise relies on a map that misrepresents the river. You cannot divide what was never bound. The platform went completely silent. What does the semantic engine say? The senior examiner asked softly. The assistant tapped the screen. I ran it through the comparative reasoning index. It returned a null value. I ran it through the strategic modeling engine. Null value. The system isn't saying the answer is wrong, sir, it's saying it doesn't recognize the structure of the response. Did he invent a new logical syntax? The younger examiner asked, bewildered. No, the senior examiner said quietly, his eyes fixed on the neat, unassuming handwriting. Every word is ordinary. The grammar is basic. Then why can't the most powerful computer in the sector judge it? The senior examiner didn't answer right away. He stood staring at the screen, his ancient mind racing back through centuries of testing history, through thousands of archived answers written by prime ministers, generals, and Nobel-equivalent scholars. Slowly, the old man turned his head toward the quiet glass windows overlooking the gardens outside. Lock the evaluation network, the senior examiner ordered abruptly. The assistant gasped. Sir. Locking the network will halt automated processing for every candidate currently in the room. Lock it, he repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. Isolate the processing queue. And bring me the original design archives for the cognitive assessment, the original source files from 200 years ago. Sir. Those files haven't been opened since the founding of the coalition. Open them, the senior examiner said, his voice barely above a whisper. Now. Deep within the secure administrative vaults of the Orion Complex, holographic projection tables flickered to life, casting a pale blue light across the faces of the 7 chief examiners. Layer after layer of encrypted historical records poured across the screens, drafts, statistical models, and philosophical debates dating back 2 centuries to the creation of the Galactic Assessment. For 200 years, the test had been revered as the ultimate measure of objective intelligence. But as the examiners dug deeper into the raw code of the original scenario, a chilling reality began to take shape. The young assistant examiner pointed a trembling finger at the foundational logic branch of the exam question. Look here, she whispered. In the very first paragraph of the problem, the creators embedded a foundational axiom. They assumed that Sector 4's trade routes were naturally bound to Sector 7's energy grid. Yes, another examiner said, confused. That's the premise of the exercise. The candidates are supposed to negotiate a solution based on that constraint. Except, the senior chief examiner interrupted quietly, stepping up to the table, it's not a constraint. It's an assumption. And it's factually incorrect. The room fell dead silent. When the test was designed 200 years ago, the senior examiner continued, his voice heavy with revelation, that spatial mapping was accurate. But 50 years ago, the stellar drift in Sector 4 shifted the gravitational lanes. The energy grid and the trade routes are no longer physically linked. The examiners stared at him, stunned. Every candidate who has taken this test for the last half-century, the senior examiner murmured, has read that paragraph, accepted the false premise without checking it, and spent 4 hours writing brilliant, highly sophisticated solutions to a problem that does not actually exist in reality. He looked back at the screen displaying Nathan's single handwritten sentence. Your premise relies on a map that misrepresents the river. You cannot divide what was never bound. He didn't solve the puzzle, the assistant whispered, her eyes wide with awe. He realized the puzzle was built on a lie. Not a lie, the senior examiner corrected gently. An outdated assumption. Every brilliant mind in this hall, every species that prides itself on logic, looked at the test and assumed that because it was written by the evaluation board, it must be divine truth. They trusted the authority of the paper more than they trusted their own fundamental observations. He didn't fail the test, the younger examiner realized, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. The test failed him. The automated grading system couldn't score his answer because the system itself was programmed to only accept answers that agreed with the flawed premise. The senior examiner slowly leaned against the table, closing his eyes. For 200 years, he said softly, we have been rewarding the people who are exceptionally good at solving problems inside a broken box. And we have been completely blind to the rare few who look at the box and tell us it shouldn't be there at all. Meanwhile, outside in the sunlit garden, Nathan Walker was sitting on a wooden bench beneath the shade of a wide, silver-leafed tree. He had a paper cup of warm, dark coffee in his hands. It wasn't great, but it was hot, and he was watching a small, spherical maintenance drone trim the hedge across the stone walkway. An elderly groundskeeper, wearing faded coveralls and pushing a manual leaf cart, paused near the bench. He looked at Nathan, then at the empty garden paths. "You're out early," the old man noted, leaning on his broom handle. "Test usually goes until mid-afternoon." Nathan took a slow sip of coffee and smiled. "Finished early." The groundskeeper chuckled softly, a wheezy, pleasant sound. "Ah. One of those who gives up in the first hour, huh?" "Well, no shame in it," the old man said, sweeping a stray silver leaf into his cart. "Sometimes knowing what you don't know is the smartest thing a man can do." Nathan looked up at the towering glass dome of the academy rising above the tree-line. The sun reflected brightly off its polished surface, hiding the thousands of stressed minds working inside. "My dad used to fix old farm machinery," Nathan said conversationally, resting his arms on his knees. Whenever a tractor broke down, the neighbors would spend hours arguing over which expensive part to order. "My dad would just stand there, look at the engine, and ask one question: are we sure we're fixing the thing that's actually broken?" The groundskeeper paused, eyeing Nathan with a flicker of genuine interest. "Smart man, your dad." "Simple man," Nathan corrected gently. He just didn't like wasting time fixing things that weren't broken, or using broken tools to fix good things. Before the old man could reply, the quiet rustle of gravel interrupted them. 3 high-ranking academy officials, dressed in formal navy and gold ceremonial sashes, were marching down the garden path. At the center of the group was the senior chief examiner himself. The groundskeeper quickly stepped aside, bowing his head respectfully. The officials stopped right in front of Nathan's bench. Nathan looked up from his paper cup, his expression mild. "Did I forget to turn in my pencil?" he asked politely. The senior chief examiner looked down at the young human in the faded gray sweatshirt. There was no sternness in the old scholar's eyes anymore. There was only a quiet, profound intensity. "Mr. Walker," the senior examiner said softly, "would you be so kind as to accompany us back inside? There are 7 chief examiners who would very much like to ask you a few questions." The private conference room on the top floor of the Orion complex overlooked the entire city. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a panoramic view of shuttles darting between silver spires, but inside, no one was looking at the view. Nathan stood at the edge of a massive mahogany table. Projected on the wall behind him was his own examination booklet, his single handwritten sentence magnified 10 times its original size. Gathered around the table were the 7 chief examiners, along with a dozen senior researchers and lead logicians representing the galaxy's elite institutions. "Mr. Walker," the senior examiner began, leaning forward with his hands planted on the wood. "We have spent the last 2 hours analyzing your submission. We verified the spatial mapping data for Sector 4. You were correct. The premise of question 1 was structurally invalid." Nathan nodded mildly. "I figured." A lead researcher, a fiery, 3-eyed scholar from a high-tech star system, stepped forward, looking intensely frustrated. "If you saw the error immediately, why didn't you write out a full correction? You could have drafted a mathematical proof demonstrating the shift in stellar drift. You had 4 hours. You could have written a masterpiece." Nathan looked at the researcher with genuine, unpretentious curiosity. "Why would I spend 4 hours writing a proof to convince people who wrote the test that they made a mistake?" Nathan asked softly. The room went silent. "I didn't come here to argue with the test," Nathan continued, his voice calm and conversational. "I came here to take it. But when I read the prompt, I realized that if I answered it the way you wanted, I'd be lying. And if I spent 4 hours trying to fix your scenario, I'd just be playing a game you designed." "It isn't a game," the researcher snapped. "It's the highest cognitive evaluation in known space. Then why didn't anyone check if the map was right before printing 10,000 copies of it?" Nathan asked gently. The question hit the room like a physical impact. Several researchers looked down at their slates. One older examiner slowly sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples. When I was in high school physics, Nathan said, leaning casually against the back of a chair, my teacher gave us a test with a trick question. Everyone spent 2 hours trying to solve a circuit diagram that had an open loop. The kids who got A's were the ones who wrote down all the math anyway to prove they knew the formulas. But my teacher gave them C's. Why? The assistant examiner asked, fascinated. Because he told us, giving a polished, intelligent answer to a fundamentally flawed question doesn't make you smart. It just makes the flaw harder to see. Nathan looked around the room at the decorated scholars. You built an incredible testing system here, Nathan added sincerely. It finds the best calculators in the galaxy. It finds people with incredible memories and unbelievable stamina. But if you only reward people who accept your premises without question, you aren't finding the smartest minds. What are we finding, then? The senior chief examiner asked quietly. Nathan met the old scholar's eyes. You're finding the most obedient ones. The silence that followed was absolute. Outside, a heavy cloud drifted over the sun, casting a soft shadow across the conference room. The senior chief examiner stood still for a long moment. Then, slowly, he walked over to the glass wall, looking down at the vast dome of Examination Hall 1 below them. Thousands of candidates were still down there, sweating over their papers, filling page after page with brilliant, useless calculations. Mr. Walker, the senior examiner said without turning around. If you were in my position, if you were the one charged with testing the minds of a galaxy, what question would you ask them? Nathan thought about it. He didn't answer right away. He looked at his worn sneakers, then at the simple analog watch on his wrist. I wouldn't ask them to solve a problem I created, Nathan said softly. I'd hand them a blank page, give them a real machine that wasn't working, and ask them one simple thing. Tell me why this shouldn't be built in the first place. The senior examiner turned back slowly, a faint, sad smile gracing his old features. Thank you, Mr. Walker, he said quietly. You are dismissed. 4 hours after the start of the assessment, the giant doors of Examination Hall 1 swung open, and thousands of exhausted candidates flooded out into the bright afternoon air. They were drained, pale, and talking nervously in dozens of languages. Question 1 was brutal, an avian candidate groaned, rubbing his temples. The resource calculations for Sector 4 took me 2 full hours. I managed to balance the trade deficit, the chrome-skinned candidate declared proudly. Stepping into the courtyard with his chest puffed out. It required a 7-tiered logic matrix, but my solution was flawless. I guarantee a top-tier score. He looked around the courtyard, half expecting to see the solitary human sitting somewhere in disgrace. But Nathan Walker was nowhere to be found. Suddenly, the public address system across the entire complex chimed with a deafening tone. Attention all candidates, faculty, and planetary delegations. Please assemble immediately in the central amphitheater for an unprecedented announcement from the Board of Examiners. A wave of confusion swept through the crowds. The results weren't supposed to be announced for 3 days. 10 minutes later, thousands of candidates sat packed in the marble bleachers of the open-air amphitheater. On the main stage stood the 7 chief examiners. The senior chief examiner stepped up to the podium. He carried no digital slates, no lists of names, and no awards. He held only a single, plain sheet of paper. For 200 years, the old man's voice echoed through the massive arena. This institution has claimed to identify the premier intellects of our galaxy. We assigned scores, awarded medals, and placed individuals into positions of immense power based on their performance in these halls. He paused, sweeping his eyes over the silent crowd. Today, we were reminded of a painful truth. Intelligence is not the ability to solve the equations handed to you by authority. Intelligence is the courage to question whether the equation deserves to be solved at all. A murmur ran through the audience. Candidates looked at each other, confused. Due to a fundamental conceptual error identified in today's testing materials, the senior examiner announced clearly. The results of the Galactic Cognitive Assessment for this cycle are officially annulled. Gasps erupted across the arena. The chrome-skinned candidate jumped to his feet, his silver face flushed with shock. Annulled? I spent 6 years preparing for this. A new evaluation framework will be constructed, the senior examiner continued, ignoring the rising commotion. One that does not merely reward memory, speed, and blind compliance. Effective immediately, the Galactic Cognitive Assessment is suspended until further notice. He looked up at the sky, his voice softening slightly. We leave you today with a single sentence, written earlier by a candidate who finished his examination in 4 minutes. A sentence that will now be engraved over the archway of these gates for generations to come. The old man read from the paper in his hand, before you spend your life searching for better answers. Make sure you haven't forgotten how to question the problem itself. Miles away from the chaotic complex, the high-speed public atmospheric shuttle glided smoothly through the upper clouds, heading toward the planetary spaceport. Nathan Walker sat in a quiet window seat near the back. His canvas backpack rested between his feet, and his worn mechanical pencil was clipped neatly to his sweatshirt collar. He leaned his head against the cool glass, watching the grand silver spires of the Orion Academy slowly shrink into the distance. The seat beside him was empty, but the warm afternoon sun felt good against his shoulders. He didn't have a medal. He didn't have a prestigious title, or a high-ranking government appointment waiting for him back on Earth. His father's farm still needed a new fence, and his old car still had a slow oil leak in the crankcase. Nathan took out his watch, wound the small silver knob until he felt the spring tighten, and listened to the steady, quiet tick-tick-tick of the gears. He smiled to himself, closed his eyes, and drifted off to sleep as the shuttle carried him home.